Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. It's hard to believe, but we're now in our fourth year of talking with changemakers around the world about the work they do. In this new series, I wanted to dig into that old childhood idiom of sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us, because we know that's just not true these days. Our words can be loving and encouraging, or they can be weaponized, hurtful, and shut down conversations. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones explores the cause and effect of polarization, the words we use, and I hope we learn how we can navigate difficult conversations. I'll be talking with artists, activists, academics, psychologists, politicians, and people like you and me, looking for those beautiful questions that change hearts and minds, one conversation at a time. I'd like to introduce you to Jason Moore. Jason is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University. Jason is either the author or editor of Capitalism in the Web of Life, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crisis of Capitalism, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. His books and essays on environmental history, capitalism, and social theory are widely recognized, and he's a prominent figure in the study of the interconnectedness of capitalism and known for his world ecology perspective. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. The last time we talked, the world seemed like a kinder and gentler place. That was pre-Zoom. And I'm wondering if you could help bring us up to speed. What's happened between then and now? What's your journey been like? How's your thinking changed, or has it changed over the years?
Well, what I came to embrace over the course of the pandemic and then the associated invocations of fairly repressive legislation, like your own Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoking anti-terror legislation to suppress civic dissent, what I came to understand is something that Noam Chomsky has been arguing for well over a half century. The more educated you are, the more indoctrinated you are. And from that basis, I came to see what I had already been arguing, but in a deeper way. And we can look at the questions of the climate crisis in particular, that what we are seeing and what we have seen indeed since the first Earth Day is the emergence of a climate and environmental ideology that is effectively a managerial ideology, a business as usual ideology. If you go back to the origins of environmentalism in places like Canada and the United States, they're around conservationism, that is the rational use of resources for business, and then preservationism, the expulsion, of course, of indigenous peoples and the so-called, preserving nice spaces of the scare quotes wild for rich and affluent folks. So there's a longer history of thinking that is very much premised on dualism. And dualism is not a distinction. Dualism is, as we know in managerial ideology, and this is also the case with environmental thinking, there are the thinking things and the doing things. This is from Descartes centuries ago, and there's an interesting history to that. Dualism is premised on radical exclusion of property. So man versus, and now I'm getting to my short answer to your great question, which is man versus woman, straight versus not straight, West versus West, white versus not white, settler versus indigenous. There are a whole long series of such dualisms that are premised on an either or logic. And I think what we're seeing over the past few years is the full embrace of this by people who fancy themselves as left liberals and by people who fancy themselves as right or conservative. And the result is an absolutely pathological and diversionary form of what's usually called the culture wars.
In one of the essays you sent me, you wrote, for everyone who wants to say that capitalism is an economic system rather than a class society, it's worth remembering that the rich and powerful don't rule by guns and wealth alone. They require ideologies, and these have contributed mightily to the climate crisis. Is it too simplistic to suggest that these ideologies have impacted most of the world's issues?
100%. Yes, that's exactly what I'm getting at. That there are two major ways that the ruling ideas of our times, and these have been in formation since the era of Columbus onwards, but these ruling ideas work in two major ways. One is a set of scientific premises that instrumentalize the world. So, as Raj Patel and I have argued in Seven Cheap Things, that the drive of capitalism is to seek to turn webs of life, including human webs of life, into profit-making opportunities at every point. So there's an instrumental moment, and there's an ideological moment. And in fact, this process of the dualism or the binary of so-called society and so-called nature is there at every step. What we see with all of these major cultural categories is a logic of dualism, a binary code that is, in fact, if you will, the source code of capitalist modernity. Folks have not been able to break free of the capitalist mode of thought, which is a polarizing, a binary mode of thought, in favor of a more holistic, but also a more relational mode of thought, because you can be holistic and still see a world of fragment.
I loved your comment about it being the source code. It really illustrates what's going on.
Absolutely. I think one of the great casualties of the neoliberal triumph over the past 50 years that reinforces this Chomsky truism, the more educated we are, the more indoctrinated we are, is what I call the flight from world history. And educated citizens, social movements, even most scholars who are writing about the climate crisis have extremely little interest in world history. The assumption is that bad machines and bad resources are causing the climate crisis. So the steam engine and coal is somehow driving the climate crisis. The climate crisis is fundamentally a crisis of overcarbonization. Now, overcarbonization is a real thing. There is a real transition to a new climate system has yet to be determined as a result of greenhouse gases and the inability of the biosphere to absorb those greenhouse gases. That's all true. That's not an explanation. And as I've argued for about 25 years, the origins of, well, first I was talking about the environmental crisis and then increasingly the climate crisis. The origins are found in the centuries after Columbus. They're not fundamentally about machines. Now, we talked about the source code. And I want to ask, why is it we tend to identify the steam engine instead of, for instance, the modern cartographic revolution, the clock-making revolution, the revolution in ways of seeing and knowing the world that were overwhelmingly about quantifying everything? Well, that goes to a very complex story, but a very simple answer, that there was a crisis of feudalism under conditions of climate crisis, the so-called Little Ice Age, in which the rulers of Western Europe were defeated. And out of the chaos and tumult of that times, there ended up being a process of the invasion, the commercialization, the commodification, the conquest of the Americas, which in turn generated a new climate crisis, as we know from the slaving-induced genocides of the New World, very much directly tied to not just the acquisitive spirit of capitalism, but its militarized character. So when I say that capitalists don't just rule by guns, that should be taken seriously. On the other hand, many folks, and this is true in climate justice and eco-socialist movements especially, deny the essentially military and coercive character of capitalist rule over the past 5 centuries. So these are questions that come into light once we open our eyes to a series of questions that come out of the origins of the crisis. And then we can begin to develop the long cycles of that crisis developing over long periods of historical development. So when you begin to look at the Industrial Revolution, you see that its epicenter was not about coal. What was the most expensive item in textile manufacturers' budgets in the late 18th and early 19th centuries? It wasn't labor, it wasn't coal, it was cotton. Where did the cotton come from? It came from the United States and the antebellum South, which was the result of the dispossession of indigenous peoples, the revival of slavery, and around the cotton gin and the cotton plantation. And oh, by the way, it wasn't just indigenous peoples who were dispossessed, but the particular strain of cotton, hirsutum cotton, that indigenous peoples developed was a strain that could withstand machine milling. And so it was specifically central to the dynamics of the so-called Industrial Revolution. What does this do? This changes our whole mindset around what are the relations driving the climate crisis. And I've tried to summarize these in a slogan, which is the capitalogenic trinity: climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid. Those are not the result of climate crisis today, but the causes of it.
You wrote that whether or not climate justice movements will succeed and become a climate insurgency will turn on their capacity to elaborate new ontological politics that defy and disrupt the capitalist mode of thought. Isn't this a bigger question?
Yeah, I think it is. This is ultimately the question around capitalism or socialism. And it remains to be seen how world politics will unfold over the next decade. In my view, capitalism today is dead. It is a zombie capitalism. That is, it is dead. It is still deadly, but its inner sources of dynamism have been extinguished. And we can get into that, but the shortest possible version of it is that between pollution, including the climate crisis from carbonization, and the appropriation of new frontiers of cheap nature that have unfolded over the centuries, capitalism's inner sources of dynamism and its ability to fix its crises are gone. So today, what we see is not just efforts at holism from the left, but also from the masters of the universe. If you look at the discourse centering around a vast Anthropocene conservation eco-industrial complex that involve the World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, the UN Environmental Program, environmental ministries, and very, very powerful NGOs like Conservation International, a group that has been happy to greenwash for outfits like Monsanto, Shell, and as the ecologist undercover investigators found, even for a hypothetical arms manufacturer. This is the group that says, well, what do we need today? We need planetary stewardship. So this is the holism of the rich that is being advanced under the guise of climate justice politics. On the other hand, what I think I'm saying, and you're absolutely right to ask, well, is this a bigger question? Yes, fundamentally, this is an argument about a reimagining, a democratic reimagining of the possibilities for an egalitarian, just, and sustainable transition. What I would underline is that while many people agree with that on the surface, there is the idea that somehow Parliament or Congress will convene one day and pass legislation that will ensure a nice, just, egalitarian, sustainable transition. And that's not so. It will take a revolution in thought, a cultural revolution, a revolution in ways of producing and reproducing webs of life. And that will not go according to these incrementalist illusions of if we only all go to farmers markets and set up transition towns and eat vegan and do all these other things. That does not add up to a just, sustainable, and democratic transition. Those might all be useful in their very specific moments, and I'm not making light of those, but I am making light on this dialectic, if you will, of the personal and the political. The political is absolutely personal, but we have an anti-politics of everyday life that is very much inherited from mainstream environmentalism over the past 50 years or so, which says, well, if we only do all those things, that adds up to a sustainable transition. And it not only does not, it reinforces the status quo and the holism of the rich.
I want to go back to where we started, and I'm curious, how have your conversations with your students changed?
The students are working class students who understand that the employment and labor market structures of advanced capitalism have fundamentally changed and not in their favor. There's no yuppie phenomena ahead of them. Indeed, they are much more likely to be baristas than they are to be well-paid professionals. At the same time, because of the neoliberal gutting of public universities, which of course is much more advanced in the United States than in Canada, The professors are much, much more conservative and have fully embraced what I call, following Michael Parenti, and anything but class leftism. That is a steadfast refusal to identify the fundamental class dynamics and capital dynamics of polarization. I think it's that polarization that is the gravitational field, if you will, for all the other kinds of polarizations you've mentioned.
I'm curious, have the questions changed in class?
A little bit. I think that what I see, and this of course varies from university to university, is that the students are open and aware. And for the most part, they are passive. I think most of society is passive. There are occasional venting episodes that don't translate, and they're venting episodes not because they're unimportant, by the way, and I want to underline these. I'm not making light of these concerns. I'm making light of how the issues were framed and the failure of a politics. So if we go back to Occupy, a movement without demands of any kind, and we follow that kind of social movement upheaval through to Black Lives Matter and many other elements, it is the failure of politics. It is the failure of politics that is so great that even when there are anti-war demonstrations, of which there are hardly any, even though we are essentially in the midst of World War III, even there, when students protested around recent events with the renewal of Israel's war on the Palestinian people, they refuse to make political demands. They don't even know that they can make political demands. For instance, what Central American solidarity movements did in the U.S. and elsewhere in the 1980s, succeeding in at least advancing political demands over ending support for death squad oligarch regimes like in El Salvador, Guatemala, and elsewhere. And so this is deeply problematic. This is the phenomena with Greta Thunberg, who is also a pro-war figure and refuses to make actual political demands, instead speaks in terms of generic slogans. And people can be impressed or not with these slogans and the way that she speaks. Incidentally, maybe folks have forgotten about it, and perhaps less so in Canada than elsewhere. But this was the phenomena. Forgive me, I forget the name of Suzuki's son around the time of the Rio conference in 1992, which was Thunberg before Thunberg. And I'm not criticizing these young people for having the courage to step forward. I'm identifying the problem as a failure of political imagination and of political demands. And without political demands, there is going to be no hope for a democratic and just climate transition.
This is a bit of a stretch, but I was reading a book, Propaganda and Persuasion, and I ran across a section that says the spiral of silence, which describes people supporting popular opinions presented in the media and suppressing unpopular ones.
We see a lot of that.
Yeah, I think what struck me is, what aren't we saying?
Well, class for one and imperialism for another. One of the surprising things that I discovered, although it was right in front of me the whole time, is the utter failure of mainstream environmentalism and more recently the Anthropocene discourse over the past 20 years, their abject failure to identify imperialism and the drive to world war and the dynamics of the military industrial complex and a militarized accumulation generally. So the Anthropocene is a term, age of man, that is coined right around the turn of the century by Eugene Sturmer and Paul Crutzen, and then becomes a veritable academic cottage industry ever since. The synchronicity with this is the onset of America's forever wars. According to the Tufts Military Interventions Project, 1/3 of over 500 American foreign military interventions in American history, 1/3 of those interventions have occurred since 1999. The synchronicity with the Anthropocene climate crisis awareness is extraordinary. So when people say to me, well, the Anthropocene, the age of man, which is problematic for other reasons, it says, well, humans did it. Humans did not do it. Capital did it. But they say, well, at least it raises awareness. And I say, not at least, it raises precisely the wrong kind of awareness. And oh, by the way, this problem is not new. If we go back to the first Earth Day in April 1970, which mobilized over 20 million Americans in teach-ins around the so-called environmental crisis. Never mind, there wasn't a global environmental crisis at the time. There were environmental problems. A week after that, American and South Vietnamese army units roll into Cambodia and Laos under Nixon's orders. That sets in motion the greatest anti-war movement in American history. The University of California, Cal State University is shut down. The National Guards are mobilized over 24 times in 14 states, called out to eventually murder sleeping students in Jackson, Mississippi, and 4 students, of course, in Kent State. The environmental movement, the Earth Day infrastructure, does nothing, nor did it do anything in the ongoing recovery, if you will, of the Carter-Reagan military buildup, the second Cold War, military interventions in Central America, then Panama, Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. The only group that ever did, a national group that ever did anything, was Greenpeace, which is not really an environmentalist group, is an anti-nuke group. And nuclear disarmament groups always had a very different politics. So this is really, really important when we're addressing these questions of environmental justice and climate justice, abstracted from the actual history of environmentalism and the ways in which environmental imaginaries are not about justice. There are environmental justice imaginaries, and those are distinctive. But the mainstream environmental imaginaries around sustainability and climate justice has now been wholly appropriated by the UN and Biden and all the rest, is not a left-wing, not a justice-oriented perspective or imaginary.
I keep thinking that we're going to change these things. We need to do it one conversation at a time. Is that naive?
Well, it is and it isn't. It depends how we look at it. What is it that every long-term, year in, year out, decade in, decade out organizer says? We organized every day for years and years and years and nothing happened. And then in 2 weeks, everything changed. So yes and no. I don't think it's naive, because one of the ways in which late capitalism, this kind of zombie capitalism, has degraded our capacity to have conversation, to take ideas seriously, to look at what are their weaknesses, what are their strengths. Instead, there's a binarization, a polarization, where you're 100% wrong or you're 100% right. And I see this even more with academics than I do with people in my everyday life, who I live in a working class, multiracial working class neighborhood. And I know lots of folks here, and I have conversations about politics that don't break down into sort of liberal, conservative, mainstream ways of looking at the world. They're much more outside the box. In contrast, most intellectuals are very conservative, and even those who are on the left are very, very sectarian. That is, they want to score points instead of push these ideas to see where we can go. So there's a bigger degradation of our popular intellectual faculties, of our abilities to have conversation, of our ability at an interpersonal level, we've all experienced this, to work out problems.
Do you think that there are neurological and cognitive triggers, roadblocks, systemic structures, and ideologies that get in the way of establishing trust and understanding?
Completely. The neurons that fire together wire together, right? Neuroplasticity is a way of talking about how brains rewire themselves physically, structurally, in line with our thoughts. Advertisers have long known about this. Ideologists have long known about this. This is why big lies work. So we are very much molded. Our brains are molded by the ideologies. It's not just that. If we look at just the US, and I think there are strong parallels in Canada as well, our bodies are powerfully poisoned. Endocrine disruptors, heavy metals, PFAS, atrazine, glyphosate, which is used to ripen wheat. All of those, in addition to what's called the standard American diet, have really fed an epidemic of ADHD, of all sorts of anxiety and depression disorders. It's not that those wouldn't be there anyway, but they would not be there in the intensity and with the demographic weight that they have. By the way, all of these impair our cognition, along with rising CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. They make us literally dumber, and they make us more passive. So when we begin to weave these connections, and this is something that I and my fellow travelers in the world ecology conversation do, we say we have to link together humans and the rest of nature. We have to link together the toxics, the diet, the toxic social relations of capital around work and power, the narrowing of democracy. We have to begin to explain how all of these are connected, not just say they're all connected, but to really try to identify the connective tissues, because that's when people begin to see these invisible cages. And I think that's beginning to happen. So there's a lot of discourse that's floating around that's very dangerous for the status quo right now. And that's why you have in the US, the National Security Agency directly collaborating with big tech capital to censor unpopular views, whatever they may be.
This radio program and podcast is called The Conversation Lab. Today we're speaking with Jason W. Moore about the capitogenic trinity. How do cultural, societal, or demographic factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, or political affiliation influence the dynamics of our conversations?
Well, in all sorts of ways. And I think what we want to do is we want to look underneath at what's happening. Otherwise, we end up with a kind of democratic theory of everything in which people say, well, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that and the other. So one of the dynamics is demography. Of course, a central element of ruling class ideology from Malthus onwards, I call this the long Malthusian cycle, involves demographic determinism, the use of science to explain away inequality. Well, now we're entering into a new phase of world demography with the crisis of capitalism, the ongoing so-called baby strikes, as The Economist magazine puts it, across the world. China is trying to figure out what to do about a contracting labor force, but also everyone is trying to figure out how to deal with issues of care and the crisis of cheap care, as Raj Patel and I have argued. Now, questions of ethnicity, race, indigeneity have become dramatically confused in recent years, with many on the left adopting the standpoint of, historically speaking, the political right, the idea that these are transhistorical categories and sometimes biological categories, because, of course, the standpoint of the political right and racialist thought in general is that something like race and ethnicity are biological, which they are clearly not. So how do we begin to make sense of ideologically the hardening of racial divides? And we can identify problems that unfold on the left as well as on the right, the tightening of border constraints, the uncritical adulation and rehabilitation of the ecological Indian, which is quite striking, which is an old colonial racist trope, and is now reasserted as in its inverse character as indigenous peoples are just more sustainable. That's a really strange argument for anyone on the left to make. And what we want to do is to understand that race and ethnicity in particular is a political and cultural battleground of class struggles that are largely articulated through capitalist labor markets. People don't really look into these dynamics very well. This might sound very abstract, but if you go back to the formation of racial categories in the Americas after the conquest, you can see it very clearly that European had one set of jobs to do. Indigenous and mestizos had other kinds of jobs to which they were assigned. Africans had other kinds of jobs, especially in the sugar plantation system. And that gets elaborated and reinvented in successive eras of capitalism. It's always political. It's always cultural. It also has to do with the organization of labor on a world scale. That is, the class dynamics of world accumulation in the web of life. And so we want to try to take all of those categories that are so important that you just mentioned and really see what is the history behind them? Can we go back and look at the historical origins of this problem or that problem, like we were talking about in relation to the climate crisis?
Going back to your three questions.
Exactly. And that's always our politics. Our politics is always an indirect expression of our perhaps unconscious, but nevertheless, our understanding of history. There's no such thing as a politics that's separated from history, even if you're not thinking about history. And usually what that means is that the history that you are assuming is a very, very shallow, superficial, and often very pro-systemic kind of history. This is the case when environmental justice activists today talk about something called fossil capitalism. Scholarly formulation of fossil capitalism says, well, fossil fuels are the source of the problem. No such thing. Indeed, the Industrial Revolution comes out of the Plantation Revolution and the history of racialized labor, dispossession, and all of these dynamics. So it matters quite a bit. People think it doesn't matter, but that's when it matters the most.
Is racism and prejudice innate, or is it learned through the discussions in everyday life?
Well, racism is a thoroughly modern phenomenon. Pre-modern class societies had their share of xenophobia, had their share of what we could call chauvinism in one sense or another. But let's remember that xenophobia in pre-modern societies was about keeping people out. Under capitalism, racism is about keeping people down. Why? To get their labor for free or low cost. So this is why the origins of modern racism do not appear like in some big bang metaphysic. And that's how a lot of leftists, including academics who should really know better, talk about it. That the world color line emerges only in the century or so after 1570 in the Americas, through the plantation system, through the transatlantic slave trade, through the problems of governance. You get racial taxonomies embedded in law in places like Brazil around the turn of the 16th into the 17th century. Then in places like North America and the Carolinas after the 1670s, there's Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. And there is the growing distinction that is eventually hardened into a strong binary between white and non-white, but no less than Cedric Robinson, who is now very famous for a book published about 40 years ago called Black Marxism, said, look, the English didn't need pigmentation to come up with racism. They figured it out with the Irish just fine. And indeed, Robinson goes on to criticize others who ignore the racialization of the Irish in this long-term dynamic. He has other arguments that tend towards a transhistoric racialism, and that's problematic because the history of capitalism does not move with a conflict of white versus black. Whiteness and blackness and other racial categories are invented and reinvented according to the reinvention of capitalism as a whole world ecology of power, profit, and life. And so racism gets reinvented both within countries, but also in the world ecology as a whole across different eras of capitalist history. There's one racism for the era of the Industrial Revolution, another for the Second Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, another for the neoliberal era, and so on and so forth. This is, again, dropped out of the frame that so many people say things like, oh, capitalism was racist from the beginning. The United States was racist from the beginning. This is the 1619 Project. No, it was not. And indeed, to make that argument is to let capitalism off the hook. Capitalism directly produces racial formations, racial culture, racial law, and above all, racialized labor markets in order to do what? To accumulate capital. Otherwise, let's not talk about capitalism at all. Let's pretend that capitalism doesn't exist.
So I want to go back through your body of work and ask this question. When you put all of it together, how has your work contributed to our understanding of power, ideology, and social inequality as they relate to the conversations we have?
First is that we need to look at the fundamental architecture of modern thought. And that architecture is really one of a binary code that is also a management philosophy. I'll explain what I mean. It all comes together in the 1630s and 40s with somebody, Rene Descartes. Maybe some folks know him. I think, therefore, I am. And for Descartes, there was a dualism in the structure of reality. There were thinking things and there were extended things. This was not only a separation among, this was not, I should say, a separation among equals. It was a managerial philosophy. There are the thinkers who then transmit the messages to the doers. We must become, he writes, this is a direct quote, the masters and possessors of nature. Descartes is channeling, crystallizing the zeitgeist. He wasn't the fellow who came up with it all simply because a philosopher said it. Doesn't mean that that it was always true. But it's also very important to recognize that it was Descartes was the crystallization of a long-term historical dynamic, both in philosophical thinking, but also in the problems of management. There was always the management of work, the management of war, and the management of planetary life, all simultaneously. The management of planetary life is represented in the very, very tight relationships between modern science, modern empires, and modern capital. The management of work was so important at this time because this is the moment of what Marx calls primitive accumulation, but essentially the birth of a modern wage labor working class. So managerial thinking was very much needed. And just to maybe repeat the emphasis, managerialism is also really fully elaborated in the capitalist sugar plantations, the sugar slave plantations of the West Indies and elsewhere. This is not something that waits for the Industrial Revolution. So what's happened at the same time as all this, and very much in support of this dualism, is another dualism. Today we talk about man and nature. Well, we don't say man and nature anymore, but I like to use that because it conjures the old the antiquated thinking that's still very much here. We talk about anthropogenic climate change, but that's simply man and nature thinking. That was an ideological, intellectual, philosophical, cultural invention of the 16th and 17th centuries. And it was embedded in the civilizing project. And the civilizing project was basically this Cartesian dynamic. The thinkers, the civilizers, were going to go out into the world and they were going to civilize the savages. What did civilizing the savages actually mean? That was, by the way, how they put it exactly. I'm not endorsing that formulation. Well, civilizing the savages meant, as in 1513's requerimento promulgated by the Spaniards, you are going to come and work for us, and that is the road to salvation. Arbeit macht frei hangs over the gates of modernity. And that's not an exaggeration at all. That work will set you free. Work is the path to liberation. The slavery in the American South, for instance, was widely regarded as a school for civilization. And this is the civilizing project. And it looked different in different eras. But let's remember that the Christianizing project of Columbus's era becomes a civilizing project, manifest destiny for the Americans, the civilizing mission for the French. It then gets reinvented by President Harry Truman in 1949 with the famous Point Four speech, the development and underdeveloped world speech, and then gets reinvented, I'm sad to say, in more recent sustainable development rhetoric. And so for me, I think that's what I'm always grappling with and asking people to think more deeply about, is this source code of modernity, and how do we step outside of that in favor of a dialectical historical alternative that asks these questions. When did something begin? When did it end? How did it develop? And therefore, what are the major contradictions? And what are the lessons that it gives us? It turns out it gives us quite a few lessons. Like, for instance, climate crises are bad for ruling classes. This is how feudalism is brought to its knees. And there's a golden age that follows. This is how Western Rome was brought to its knees in this moment of climate change and popular revolt. So these insights into history are very, very important to giving us an ecology of hope in the present moment.
So what's that say about democracy? I mean, Chris Hedges says we should just burn it down.
Well, democracy would be a good idea. Let's put it that way. There's the illusion somehow that once upon a time, and I'll just speak to the American case, that was much more democratic. But I mean, Don, you and I are old enough to remember the Church Commission in the United States, where Frank Church headed up a special Senate committee that investigated both CIA illegal behavior abroad and FBI counterintelligence programs within the United States, actively suppressing domestic political opposition to the war machine, amongst other things. So it's important that we really, again, look at the history and do away with our fantasies that once upon a time there's a democratic world. I often point to the example of what is widely understood in Great Britain as Britain's Watergate, which is the IMF, CIA, MI5, and MI6 soft coup of the Wilson Labor government in 1976. The Wilson government stays in power for another 3 years. But what had happened in 1974 is, in a surprise snap election, Labor wins a slight majority in the February of 1974 and comes into the government on the heels of the most radical labor program in the 20th century, even more radical than Clement Attlee's program in 46, where they created the National Health Service, council housing, all the rest of it. What happens in the aftermath is a gearing up for a coup d'etat where the British military does surprise military exercises and shuts down Heathrow Airport 3 times after the election of the Labor government. There's all this deep state MI5 surveillance of government ministers like Tony Benn, who represented the Labor left wing of the party, was a major minister in the government. This is to say that when push comes to shove, if there is ever the threat of actual democracy, the ruling classes come back with the deep state, with the national security state apparatus. So maybe we ought to give democracy a try. And indeed, the whole history of post-World War II world order is one of the U.S. repeatedly, structurally undermining actually existing democracies, from Mossadegh and Arbenz in Iran and Guatemala in 53 and 54, all the way through to Allende. And of course, we've seen our share of this in recent decades, the overthrow of Evo Morales' government, the attempt in Bolivia, the multiple attempts to destabilize the democratically elected governments in Venezuela, so on and so forth. So regime change is what empires do. And they always, the British and then the Americans always flattered themselves as somehow democratic, but neither were. I mean, the U.S. is not explicitly a democracy. It's explicitly a republic that is designed by the founders to limit democracy. So I think we're in a very frightening moment. And you see in I mentioned it before, but Trudeau invoking anti-terror legislation to debank political opponents. That's something that will be increasingly deployed against, and is already being deployed, maybe not that specific legislation, but that sense of things being deployed against figures from the left.
Are we more polarized now, or have we always been polarized?
Well, if you look at it in class terms, the polarization of wealth and power is greater than ever before. I think for most academics, they come from the professional managerial class. They are the sons and daughters of, generally speaking, and there's some interesting statistical demographic evidence to support this. Like in the US, 25% of professors on the tenure track had parents who were tenured professors. So that gives you an idea of this professional managerial class mindset. Now, the first thing I want to say is it's not a class, that they are in fact part of the working class, but they have a mindset of being professionals, about being experts, about managing society, and that there is a denial on the part of many, not all, but many tenured professors of the profound polarization that is unfolding, first and foremost around class matters, but then that's the gravitational field for everything else. There's also another polarization between those, and this is always said in the United States, between those people who support the Democratic and Republican parties and those people who support neither of those two ruling parties. So the vast majority maybe not the vast majority, but a meaningful majority in the U.S. Do not support either political party, which gives us a sense of a different kind of polarization, not between liberals, conservatives, and the NDP, as in Canada, or Democrats and Republicans, but between the ruling parties and everyone else who feel absolutely disenfranchised, and they should feel disenfranchised. This is a fundamentally undemocratic system that has become progressively less democratic. And so I think that what's often interpreted as polarization, maybe we need a more robust analytical concept than just polarization. But there is clearly something that is fundamentally going on that speaks to the crisis of neoliberal hegemony in countries like Canada, the US, the UK. So you have phenomena, to your point, Don, and I think this is the example in the US, that the Bernie and Trump phenomenon in 2016 signaled precisely what you're saying about this unprecedented polarization and the breakdown of business as usual or politics as usual. And the fact is that no matter how Trump ruled, Trump ran to the left of Hillary Clinton, against free trade, against neoliberalism, against business as usual, and plugged into that sense of outrage. And so did Bernie Sanders. So can the genie be put back into the bottle? I don't think so. And the United States, to me, looks indeed on the verge of ungovernability.
How can individuals manage their emotions during challenging dialogues, particularly when their beliefs strongly differ from those of the other person, in the context of family, friends, or workplace environments? And I don't think there's a family that has not been impacted in the last 5 years with some thorny issue where there's disagreement. So I'm curious how we navigate these issues.
Well, I think it's a perfect question and so important to think deeply about. As they said in the 60s, the issue is not the issue. The difficulty in having these difficult conversations is not just because we don't know how to have the conversations. It's because life in late capitalist societies, and yes, in the global north, all things being equal, it's much, much easier. I'm not trying to say that it's the same as those who are now living under Israeli airstrikes in Gaza or in South Sudan or some other place. But everywhere, but let's just take the North America for the moment, the conditions of livelihood, of employment, of housing are disastrous, are precarious, and the level of stress that results from that is huge. Then it's reinforced by a population that has been metabolically compromised by a poisoned food system and a poisoned environment, which renders our capacity to deal with stressful situations much less. It makes it very difficult to have these conversations, these difficult conversations about difficult topics when we are stressed about housing and jobs and everything else. And then meanwhile, we are, as a population, metabolically compromised by cheap food, poisoned environment, ecology. These are coming together. I mentioned Descartes and mind and body. It's not just in some abstract philosophical sense. This is how we are dealing with our lives. We, in a literal sense, metabolize these difficult conversations. So what happens when people are stressed? They tend to take ideas and make them beliefs. And they tend to take beliefs and make them into identities. So I hear this is where you're going, that you have a conversation about, let us say, the climate crisis. And instead of people being able to say, well, what about this? What about that? It becomes a question of identity. Well, this is something that the global cabal is making up. And then we can't see that there is indeed a global ruling class, the masters of the universe, World Economic Forum. They are indeed trying to take advantage of the climate crisis to reorder the world and pursue sustainability on the backs of working classes all around the world. That is true. And it is also true that there is a climate crisis. And in these moments, it's excruciating to wrestle with the question that you're wrestling with. And I can't wait to hear more about what you're coming up with. But this combination of, for lack of a better way of putting it, social stresses and metabolic stresses and the ways that they're weaving together. And then we're fed this constant stream of culture war bullshit from the mainstream media that the problems are all about, trans rights and gender this and race this. And it's not that all of those aren't important issues, but that underlying these are the issues of rich and poor and the powerful and the powerless. And how do we really build a world of justice that is justice for everyone, instead of looking at these decoy issues that are so often getting people into a frenzy around the wrong issues. And what's the result? The result is what you saw in Canadian Parliament the other day is, people giving a standing ovation to a Nazi and not even thinking about it like, oh, this was somebody who fought against the Russians during World War II. They couldn't even process that in the moment. Like, oh, that means the guy is a Nazi. And so there's this kind of breakdown of between the rewiring of our brains, the degradation of our cognitive capacities from the social environment, but also from the metabolic environment.
So I guess that begs the question about how do we help each other with critical thinking? What practical interventions, strategies, or tools can be developed or implemented to facilitate more effective and constructive conversations?
Well, you're doing it now, Don, and I'm doing my version of it. It's not, of course, simply about podcasts and good conversation, but that's a part of it because it gives people the opportunity to share, say, in this case, our conversation with others, with friends. And then how do we build communities of conversation around that, and to take critical thinking to mean a critique of the thinking as usual entities?
I wasn't going to go here, but are you hopeful?
I'm very hopeful. And I'll tell you the shortest possible reason. I've hinted at it before, that eras of profound climate crisis in the history of human civilization have been bad for ruling classes. And there is an environmentalist narrative of collapse that I fear is inaccurate, to say the least, and is dystopian. From the Bronze Age collapse, which occurs right around the classic benchmark is 1177 BC, but in around that half century, you see this era of migration, of war, of social revolt in an era of drought, almost certainly because the North Atlantic oscillation shifted towards cold in Western Europe, and that often is calibrated to drought in the Near East. But in any event, that you see this kind of phenomena happen again and again and again, that the breakdown of civilization is usually the breakdown of ruling class authority. After the crisis of the Roman West in the 5th century, peasants across Western and Central Europe reorganized life in this incredible way. It turns out it was a golden age for peasants, not a dark age at all. They reinvented village life that had been destroyed by the Roman latifundia system. The relations between men and women were much more equal. They adjusted a fertility regime. They diversified livelihood strategies. This happened again with the crisis of feudalism at the dawn of the Little Ice Age, where workers and peasants defeated the ruling classes of Western Europe, and for over a century enjoyed a golden age. So climate crises can be extraordinarily violent and difficult in the moment. They are also very destabilizing for politics as usual. And we can take tremendous hope for that. What happens, however, is that most environmentalists are so afraid of the breakdown of the system. No, quite the contrary. We want the breakdown of the system so that we can begin to build a democratic alternative. Because so long as the system is in place, the forces of the status quo, which are not just cultural and economic, but also military, will remain in place. There has to be something dramatic that will allow this shift in consciousness. And that's exactly what we saw in Western Europe after the crisis of the Roman West and feudal Europe, where there was a new vision of how to organize life. Now, we don't want to romanticize that, and I hope I don't sound like I'm being romantic, but those are real elements of an ecology of hope as we head into the 21st century.
Wow. You've given us lots to think about. I really want to thank you for your time and for sharing so much with us. Like I said, there's lots to think about. I wonder if there's a question I didn't ask that I should have.
Well, I don't think so. I think that if I wanted to convince people listening to this of anything, I think it would be to reemphasize that the history matters. The history can give us the opportunity for being hopeful, and that we can unthink the structures of thought that have created the crisis today. We say all the time things like, oh, decolonize your thinking, or we quote, probably apocryphally, but we quote Einstein, the thinking that created the problem will not be able to resolve it. We do all of that, but so often we're not willing to take it to heart. And I mean that not just in a turn of phrase, but literally, how do we transcend those egoic, very modern structures that separate our rational minds from our emotions, from our spiritual lives? I think a lot of indigenous discourses have reminded us of the importance of that reconnection. How do we begin to fully embrace those connections, not only out there in the world between politics and environments and ecologies and cultures, but also this mind, body, spirit relation with ourselves, which is also a relation with each other? I think that's where I might underline the point. Not that you completely asked me those questions.
No, well said. Well framed. Thank you. I am incredibly grateful for your time. I'm honored that you've hung in there with me on my journey. I will.
Well, do feel free to call on me, and I'm happy to help.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, Jason.
All right. Take care, Don.
Right.
I'll look forward to next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. We've been talking with Jason Moore, who's an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University. He's also the author or editor of Capitalism in the Web of Life, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crisis of Capitalism, and A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. You can learn more about Jason online at Binghamton University and at jasonwmoore.com. Sticks and Stones, Roots and Bones is part of my dissertation project with the University of British Columbia. It's also a radio program and podcast produced in Vancouver's downtown east side at the Conversation Lab on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. It's available on community and campus radio stations across Canada and, of course, on your favorite podcasting platform. Thanks to my supervisory committee, Drs. Manel Matani, Janice Stewart, Denise Ferrara da Silva, Jan Fook, and Andy Hoffman, my cohort at UBC Social Justice Institute, friends and family who support this passion project, and of course Jason Shaw, who composed the music for us. Thanks for listening. I'm Don Schaefer.